Welcome to IVF This, episode 111, The Gap versus the Gain. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well. I was talking to a potential client the other day. She had booked a mini session and we were going through a couple of questions that I ask at the beginning, just trying to get some background and stuff like that. And she was talking about how she was going into her second full cycle, like a full retrieval cycle. Her first cycle did not produce any embryos. Like she went through the retrieval and then the ones that fertilized, they arrested at some point in the process. So this was her second attempt for embryos. But what struck me and what spurred my desire to talk about this concept on the podcast is that she said something that I have heard many, many times over from clients, from colleagues, from friends going through IVF. And that's, I did it all for nothing, or like some variation of that, right? When I was talking to my client, the thing that we discussed is the thing that I want to share with you, right? Now, before we kick it off, I want to make sure is very clear. Abundantly clear, like irrefutably clear, that we as humans judge our experience by the outcome. It's human. It's normal, pretty much by our default thinking. If this is you, there is nothing wrong with you. But I want you to think about the possibility that there is another option. There will be times that you may find it beneficial or even therapeutic. Like everything that I offer in this podcast, it's an option, right? There are times that you might find this concept or this idea beneficial. And there are going to be some times that you might want to be like, screw off, Emily. Either is totally fine. It's not going to hurt my feelings one bit. But the purpose of this episode is to show you, just like for everything, that there is another way to view these situations in which you feel like you come out of the experience, the stimulation part, the egg retrieval, the embryo development stage, if you're doing genetic testing, and certainly if the transfer is unsuccessful, there's an option, a different way to think about it, a different mindset, right? So let me introduce you to the concept of the gap versus the gain by the person who created it, Dan Sullivan. His book, cleverly titled The Gap versus the Gain, The High Achiever's Guide to Happiness, Confidence, and Success. It's kind of a mouthful, but here we are. It's a great book, by the way. So to help explain his concept, I want you to remember the episode that I did on the negativity bias, right? It's a good one to re-listen to because this concept, what I'm about to talk about, is building upon your understanding that we have a pre-existing negativity bias that lives in our brain rent-free. So 2 things that I want to teach you in this podcast. I want to teach you what the gap versus the gain actually is. And I want to make sure that you have a way to implement this information into your life so that you can start recognizing when you're measuring yourself in an unuseful way and can intentionally set yourself up to create something that you actually want to measure life in a way that compounds your happiness or compounds maybe feeling grounded or feeling neutral, right? Happiness isn't the end all be all. We just don't want to be in pain all of the time. And so that's what I want for you. So the gap versus the gain, and then a way to implement that idea. Easy peasy. So I think before we get into the specifics of how to measure anything, we can pretty much all agree that measurement has value, right? It's how we know that we've made progress. When I worked in hospital case management and then corporate healthcare, we used to throw around the phrase regularly, you can't manage what you don't measure. And I even still use that, a variation of that in like, we can't fix what we can't see when I talk to my clients, right? Now, if you are in the corporate world, you may have just vomited a little bit in your mouth. Totally understandable. I nearly did when I said it, because the corporate world kind of borders a little bit on being obsessed with key performance indicators and scorecards and dashboards and measuring, because we do know that measurement has benefit. We couldn't manage what we don't measure. And so I'm absolutely not encouraging any of us to obsess over measurement, but I do believe that it's important that we set ourselves up for success with the way that we think about the way that we measure our progress in our lives, certainly within the context of infertility and fertility treatments. Because what I found that most of us are kind of doing it wrong. Well, let me rephrase that, because wrong is like an absolute term and I don't really like to use absolute terms. So I think that most of us do it in a way that doesn't serve us. I think that's probably a better way to word it. We're really setting ourselves up to feel discouraged and defeated by how we're doing it. And we're pursuing happiness and we're measuring ourselves against the wrong thing or the thing that doesn't serve us. We're measuring ourselves against the gap versus the gain. So what do I mean by gap versus gain? Why do we care? Unhappiness, pain, comes from measuring ourselves against where we are relative to where we want to go. So in other words, unhappiness comes from measuring ourselves against where we are to where we want to go. I don't know that was in other words. I think that I just restated that completely. But happiness, on the other hand, is what we create when we measure the progress we've made based on where we've come from. Are you following me? Okay. When I hear people say, and I hear it all the time, I just don't feel like I'm living up to my potential, or I don't think this person is living up to their potential, his or her potential, right? Have you said this? I have. Hell, I think I married my first husband based on what I perceived to be his potential to begin with. So it's a thing that a lot of us get caught in. But I think for a lot of us, what is true, and it's good to remember and good to know, is that none of us will ever live up to our potential. This doesn't mean we can't, or we can't love our lives, or we can't be extremely successful, or whatever. One of my favorite coaches, Krista St. Germain, she put it like this: it's just to say that our potential always exists in the future and we live in the present. So it's impossible to measure ourselves against our potential, because what is our potential even? Our potential is a thought. It's an idea. It's not a real thing. It's a concept. It's a construct. Our potential just describes our ideas of what is possible for us, but it's not a fixed point. It's not like a tangible thing that exists. So until we die, I know this got morbid real quick, but until we die, none of us are ever living up to our potential. Doesn't mean we're not loving life. It doesn't mean we're not doing amazing things or seeing success. It just means that it's an impossible thing to measure ourselves against because it's a concept. Let me offer you this example. And surprisingly, it's a sports metaphor, which is not like a big strength of mine, so bear with me. But in the United States, we just wrapped up the men's and, most importantly, the women's college basketball finals. If you're not familiar with it, it's a massive bracket-style single elimination tournament. I'm not a huge fan of basketball, most sports besides soccer, really, but my husband loves basketball, and the women's tournament got enormous, huge press coverage this year because there are some incredible players out there right now. The final game was between the University of Iowa, which has Caitlin Clark, who is an extraordinary player, like a player of her generation, right? And Louisiana State University, LSU, which has like one of the deepest benches in sports right now. Just an extraordinary team. Right? It's unreal. It's a phenomenal team. But the reason this ties into what we're talking about is because the winner was determined based on who scored the most points. That's it. In this case, it was LSU. It was not determined nor measured based on the combined total of each team's hypothetical potential, right? It wouldn't make any sense if any championship was played like that. Both teams started at 0, and at the end of the game, we take a retrospective look and we measure the team based on the points that they gained, right? Okay, that's what I mean by focusing on the gain. That's how we want to do it. Or alternatively, how we can measure a goal. Krista, the coach I mentioned before, she offers this example. Think of this like we're running. If we were measuring ourselves by our potential and we were running, that would be like measuring ourselves based on how close we are to the horizon. We would run and run and run and run. At the horizon would still be equally far away because the horizon isn't a fixed point. The horizon is an idea. It's not actually where something physically exists. We couldn't measure our progress based on how close we were to the edge of the horizon. We would never actually try because we know better than that, right? So what I want you to take away from this is that none of us can ever live up to our potential, and that's okay. Because our potential is just an idea, not a fixed place. But when we measure ourselves based on where we are and what we could potentially do or how we feel or how we could potentially feel in the future, we're focusing on the gap. The gap is the distance between where you are and our idea of where we could be or should be. The gap is based on where we are relative to potential. On the other hand, the gain is what we find when we look backward and measure how far we've come based on where we started. I hope you can see how this is a much more useful idea in terms of measuring success, in terms of measuring anything. So again, unhappiness comes from measuring ourselves against an ideal because we'll never hit it, because the ideal will just keep changing, just like the horizon. And happiness is what we get when we measure the progress we've made based on where we came from. So the client that I talked about at the top of the episode, what we discussed was 1, she's categorized as unknown infertility, and 2, how her doctor explained that on her WTF call. If you're not familiar, that's what is referred to as when something goes wrong in the cycle or any part that failed or did not meet expectations, and you talk to your consultant and you're like, what the F just happened? That's the WTF call. Anyway, her doctor explained that watching like her body and her response to the medication during the stim cycle, the doctor learned a lot about how her body reacted to the meds. And now the doctor has some suspicions that there's maybe some silent endometriosis. And so they're going to do a bit of a workup before kind of launching into cycle 2. It's very easy to say that it was all for nothing, which is the gap, because we're measuring the outcome, right? And since the outcome was incongruent with her expectations, understandably so, that thought left her feeling extraordinarily defeated, hopeless even. But it wasn't all for nothing. Her and her medical team learned a lot about her body and how her body responds to medications and how there may be something else going on that is contributing to their difficulty. So it wasn't for nothing. Identifying the gain is all about being willing to be wrong about measuring only the outcome. We can acknowledge that the outcome was not what you hoped for. That's not what we're saying. We don't have to sugarcoat the disappointment, the sadness, the hopelessness associated with that. As long as we're also taking into consideration the things that were gained during this process. All of this is true and no less valid that if you had 2 embryos develop when maybe you expected 4, whatever the numbers might be, right? This is still a disappointment because you are measuring by the gap, the ideal, the expectation, instead of the gain. Another aspect that she gained was, for the first time in her life, her words, according to her, she was going to therapy and seeking out additional supports. And for the first time, she realized that she needed help. She asked for help. She sought it out and she utilized it. Do you truly know how monumental a step that is for a lot of people? And this isn't like some humble brag for me. She actually declined to work with me since she was just starting to see her therapist and wanted to see how that would go. And I 1,000,000% support that, because that alone, recognizing that you need support, finding support, and utilizing support, those are 3 very separate, distinct gains. Since we have been socialized to believe that our quote unquote gains should be like big and flashy and tangible, these might not seem like gains to some or even most of us, but that doesn't mean that they aren't. She learned a lot about herself during that first cycle. She, like most of us, had never even given herself injections. She learned that she could do that. She learned that she can manage the ridiculous logistics of IVF and her work and her relationships to the best of her ability. Those are gains. No 2 ways about it. Now, remembering that negativity bias the thing I mentioned earlier, a lot of us cannot admit to ourselves or acknowledge those things as gains. So to do that, you have to be very intentional about how you think about things. We have to deliberately steer our brains to look for those things. It's not necessarily going to be an automatic thing. It's not going to stare you down and say, hey, I'm the gain. No, sometimes we do have to go look for it. I think for many of us, we think about how we've checked off all of the boxes. At least like that was a whole lot of my thought process. I did all of the things that society told me I quote unquote should do, right? I went to college a few times. I married someone that I loved and we built a life. He finished school, he finished his PhD, we bought a house, we checked all the boxes, we did all of the things. So I was deeply unhappy because I was measuring myself against the progress with the things that I still had left on my to-do list rather than the things that I had checked off my to-do list, right? So I was battling the pain of infertility and the pain of wanting something along with this ideal measurement of how my life should look, right? Super painful. I was perpetually caught up in the, okay, what's next mentality, never truly allowing myself to really relish, sit in, enjoy, relish what I actually created in my life. And please, I want you to know that I did not develop this skill overnight. In all honesty, actually, I don't think I really sank in and understood this concept, and it really didn't resonate for me until after we had our failed transfer, and I had to rethink, like recalibrate everything, what I thought my life was going to look like. But that's the point. If you're measuring your progress based on the items left on your to-do list, then you're living in the gap because your to-do list is growing all the time. It's changing all of the time. It is the horizon. It never stops growing. It's virtually infinite. You finish one thing and then poof, two or 15 more things appear. So measuring our progress against infinity, it makes no sense, right? Of course, it's a recipe for frustration. And there really is no such thing as a to-do list that's like zero unless you're checked out of life. And I don't think you would be listening to the podcast if you were. So I think we're on a good wavelength here. So why do we do that to ourselves is the big question, right? Why do we not stop and look backwards and say, great job. Like you did this, you created this, you did all of these things, you're amazing. And we give ourselves credit for what we did instead of what's left to be done. And it's because we'll just keep adding to the list. And when we take into account socialization, negativity bias, a lot of the culture and socialized pressure that is placed on women, all of those things, like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? All of those things play into this. If you've been on this journey long enough, you start to measure the person that you were before to the person that you are now, which isn't a fair comparison at all because it leaves out the fact that between then and now, major upheavals in your life and your life challenges and things that you expected and heartaches and disappointment and possibly traumas have occurred along the way. So we want to measure the progress that we've made since we started this journey, however minuscule you think the gain might be. That alone puts us back into the gain. Measuring how we feel now against how we feel in the future, you're going to be in the gap. And that's not where you want to be. It's a recipe for misery. If you're really scratching your head as to any possible gain could be, I want you to hear me when I say this. You could have thrown in the towel and given up on treatment, which there's nothing wrong with that, on relationships, on your career, on life, and you didn't. You kept putting one foot in front of the other. Here you are. You're listening to a podcast talking about improving your mental health. That's something. So I encourage you to own and take credit for it. Build on it. Give yourself credit for not giving up. Give yourself credit for being this resilient, amazing, incredible person that you are. Measure yourself based on how far you've come relative to where you are, not how far you could potentially go. So that's the gap versus the gain. When we're focused on what is in front of us, what's between where we are and the ideal or the idea of where we could potentially go, recipe for disaster, recipe for pain. We want to focus on where we are and look backwards to where we've come. We want to set a goal that we can measure ourselves based on where we came from. We owe it to ourselves to celebrate who we are and how far we've come, even and most especially when we're waiting on that baby. And I've said this 1,000 times, but a baby doesn't solve for these things. That's not a baby's job. That future baby, that baby that you hold in your mind and in your heart, that baby's job is to eat and sleep and poop and grow, not to fix whatever you perceive to be wrong with you or your life, because there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with your life. You've never been taught these things, more than likely. You let yourself celebrate those little wins along the way. Allow yourself to revel in the fact that you are going through some really, really hard stuff. And you've done it with far more grace, compassion, composure than you will ever give yourself credit for. But I will. I will always be the one to hold that belief for you, for each and every one of you. And I'm happy to do that until you're ready to hold it yourself. So that is what I have for you today, my friends. Have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.